We are in the midst of a series called Yes, You, fulfilling God's purpose. And the idea is that we're going to look at some very unique stories in Scripture, very unique characters, for lack of a better term. And when we see them, we notice that they're not who we would expect God to use. Last Sunday, we looked at the least likely to succeed. Notice that David would have been overlooked and not expected to do anything great, and yet look at all that God did through King David. This morning, we're going to look at the outsider. The outsider in Joshua chapter 2. If you want to start finding that, Joshua is the 6th book of the Bible, so it's all the way back toward the beginning of the Old Testament. And we're going to be in chapter 2 in just a moment. Do you know what it feels like to be the outsider? The kid who gets picked last in kickball. I never did like those team captains. They always picked last. Standing alone at the junior high dance while you watch all your friends out on the dance floor. That couple not included in the dinner party. A Texas Baptist pastor moving into a Czech Catholic community. The outsider. I want to introduce you this morning to a lady who was an outsider in every way. If we were to think about who deserves to be included in God's people, who God might use for great things, she would be at the bottom of our list. She was an outsider in every way. She was not even an Israelite. She was a Canaanite. Canaanites, those people who were the enemy. Those people who had rebelled against God for so long, he was ready to bring judgment on them and turn their land over to his people. She was one of them. She didn't follow Yahweh. She was a pagan. She was even a prostitute. Certainly that person outside of God's plan, outside of God's people, she was the last person you would expect God to use to accomplish his will. But you're about to hear how God can use even an outsider like her. Matter of fact, I would even argue this morning that God seems to prefer to work through people like her so that it's clear that he's the one doing the work. In 1 Corinthians, Paul said, "Consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise according to the worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong." In other words, we might think of it like this. If God picked the popular, the best looking, the brightest, the most talented, we would think they did the amazing work on their own because they could do that stuff. But when he chooses the outsider, the overlooked, the weak person, someone with a past, but apparently no future, and he chooses to use that person, then it's obvious that he is the one at work. Let's look together at the outsider. Let's get to know Rahab a little bit in Joshua chapter 2. And you'll remember the story. Moses leads the people out of Egypt, and they come relatively quickly. They get to what should be the border of the promised land. He sends a couple of spies. He sends 12 spies in. They look around. They come back. Most of them say, oh, those dudes are big. We can't do it. 2 of them say, hey, we got this. With God's help, we can take the land. And God said, because you didn't have faith, all those spies came back and said, no, we can't. You still haven't learned to trust me enough. So you're not ready to take the land. So go back into the wilderness. And they wandered for 40 years through the wilderness. The idea was we're going to let the unfaithful die off so a new generation can take over. And then Moses hands off leadership to Joshua. And Moses dies. Moses himself didn't get to enter the land. He saw it, but he didn't get to enter it. And now it's time for Joshua, the leader of God's people, to take God's people into the land promised to them. And remembering the idea of the spies, he sent 2 spies ahead. Go in and figure out. Now, his plan is not go in and see if we can. Remember, he's one of the spies in the first story who said, with God's help, we can do it. No question. So now when he sends 2 spies in, it's not to find out if they can do it. It is instead just to plan the strategy. Figure out where we're going and how we can get this started. And so in chapter 2, verse 1, Joshua the son of Nun sent 2 men secretly from Shittim as spies, saying, go, view the land, especially Jericho. Why Jericho? Well, mainly because it was the first town they came to. When they first entered the land that would be theirs, they entered Canaan. The first little town is Jericho. And not only was it first in the way they were coming in, but it's also most strategic because it's kind of central. And the idea is if we can take Jericho, then that's going to divide Canaan into two sections, and now we can branch out north and south, and we can eventually take the whole land that way. And so he said, go in and look around, especially Jericho. And they went and came into the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab and lodged there. It was told to the king of Jericho, behold, men of Israel have come here tonight to search out the land. Then the king of Jericho sent to Rahab, saying, bring out the men who have come to you, who entered your house, for they have come to search out the land. But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them. And she said, true, the men came to me, but I didn't know where they were from. And when the gate was about to be closed at dark, the men went out. I do not know where the men went. Pursue them quickly, for you will overtake them. But she had brought them up to the roof and hid them with stalks of flax that she had laid in order on the roof. The first thing that I want us to think about and notice as we talk about the outsider is that God gave her courage. These 2 spies come in and they go to this house. Now, one of the reasons that they stopped at this house was that her house was a part of the wall. It was built into the wall that surrounded Jericho. So it was one of the first places that they could go. And they go into the house and they talk with her, and she knows who they are. She knows what they're about. Now she has to make some decisions. Will she host them, welcome them? Will she provide for them? Will she turn them in? God gave her the courage that she needed to do God's plan. Why did she need courage? Because what she's doing is treason. Did you notice that even the king knew about this? We don't know how he knew. Somebody told on him. But somehow the king knew that these two spies from Israel were at her house. And so to keep them, she was committing treason. And certainly that had to be fearful. And so what she did was, when the folks came to ask, she said, "Oh, I didn't know who they were. And, they went out the gate just before it closed. I'll bet if you take off now, you can go catch them before they get too far." As I read those first few verses, all I could think about was that old cartoon. Do you remember the old cartoon with the sheepdog? Which way did he go? Do you remember? That just kept bouncing around in my, which way did he go? I can see these representatives of the king. Which way did he go? And she says, "Oh, they went that way, They already went out the gate. I'll bet if you run fast, you can catch them." And she knew all along that they were up on the roof of her crib. How? Because back then, they didn't have pitched roofs like we do. They were flat, and they would store stuff up there. If it was nice, sometimes that was kind of like a guest room. But she would store stuff up there. She had what they call flax. Now that's a plant that has a bunch of fibers in it, and so they would use those fibers actually to make material, kind of like linen. They would use those plants to sew. And so she had a bunch up there on her roof, and she hides them under those stalks, and she says, I don't know who they were, where they came from, or where they went out the gate. Go get them. God gave her courage. But God also gave her faith. As she tells the king's representatives, they went out the gate. She knows that the men are hiding up on the roof. And then she goes up to the roof to speak to them. Look at verse 9. She said to the men, these are the spies who are hiding, "I know that the Lord," now you notice that's all caps. What does that mean? We've talked about it before. When you see the word Lord in all caps, that means that this is his proper name. This is Yahweh. In other words, she says, "I know your God, Yahweh, has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how the Lord," that's Yahweh again, "we have heard how Yahweh dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites." She says, we've heard, we know, and because of that, she knew that Yahweh was giving them the land, and she and the rest of the people around her knew what they were in for. Verse 11, "And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted. There was no spirit left in any man because of you, for Yahweh, your God, he is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath." Now understand the power of that statement. God has given her this faith because she is a pagan in a pagan land, and these people worshiped multiple gods. And yet now she says, "But Yahweh, your God, he's the real God. He's the God of heaven, and he's the God of earth. He is the one true God." Only God could give her that kind of faith. And so she speaks that truth, and she lets them know, "I am helping you because I trust your God." Hebrews chapter 11 is what we call the Hall of Faith. Great people are listed in Hebrews 11. Those people who demonstrated great faith that made a huge difference in God's redemptive plan. In that grand list of the people of faith, there are only two women mentioned. One of them is Sarah, Abraham's wife. The other woman mentioned in the list is a prostitute, a harlot, a pagan, Rahab. In Hebrews 11 and 31, by faith Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had given friendly welcome to the spies. Her faith included her in that great list of faith, and the way we know she had that faith was because of the actions she took that night. James, later in the book of James, he would say that when Rahab acted on her faith, that's what let us know that her faith was real enough that now we know she was actually saved by God. It was accounted unto her as righteousness, we might use another phrase. God gave her courage, and God gave her faith, and God gave her a promise. So she protected these guys, and she said, I'm doing this because I know your God, Yahweh, is the real God, and I know he's going to come and get us because we're pagans and he's bringing judgment. She said, I understand all that, I believe all that. And she then says, but since I'm helping you, would you do me a favor? Would you help me? When you guys come into the land to take the land, to wipe out Jericho, would you protect me and my family? And so they came up with a plan. Look at verse 18. The spies told her, yeah, we'll take care of you and your family. We'll make sure that they're provided for. Verse 18, behold, when we come into the land, you shall tie this scarlet cord in the window, through which you let us down. And you shall gather into your house your father, your mother, your brothers, and all your father's household. Then if anyone goes out the doors of your house into the street, his blood shall be on his own head, and we shall be guiltless. But if a hand is laid on anyone who is with you in the house, his blood shall be on our head. So here was the arrangement. After she protected them and helped them hide from the king's people, she then helped them out the window. And remember, she lived in the wall that surrounded the town. So when she helps them out the window, she is helping them out of town. And she lowered them down with a rope. They're ready to take off. But before they leave, they make this agreement. When we come back, we're going to tell everybody to look for a crimson rope hanging from this window. And when they see that red rope, they won't bother anybody inside. We'll take care of your family in that way. Now, we don't know how they came up with that plan, but we can speculate. Because it really has not been that long since Passover, the original Passover. Surely some of them might even remember it. At least they remember and have heard the story many, many times. How the people of Israel were in Egypt. God kept telling Pharaoh, let them go, and Pharaoh was stubborn. So there was one event after another that was supposed to shake up Pharaoh, and these crises that followed one after another, and Pharaoh would give in and then back up and then give in. So finally the last one, the last plague in Egypt, God said, I'm going to send the angel of death, and he's going to take out the firstborn of every family. But Israelites, my people, sacrifice a lamb. Put the blood of the lamb across the door of your household. And when the angel of death comes by, he will see that blood sacrificed on your behalf, and he will pass over your house. Now, I suspect that these spies knew that story very well. And instead of saying, put blood on your door, they said, put a rope that's the same color. Put that crimson, that red rope out the window, and then when we come by, we will pass by your house. And we'll make sure that everybody inside is protected. That picture of Passover, to them it was an immediate experience. It was the way they were protected. Now, here is a robe that was an immediate experience. It's the way that Rahab's people were protected, and it it points us, reminds us that we too can be covered by the blood of one sacrificed on our behalf. That when we trust in Christ, when we believe in Jesus, when we live for Him, then the blood that He shed on Calvary covers us. And one of these days when the angel of death comes around, He'll pass over. We will be transferred into glory, into the presence of Christ, but death will have no hold over us. I think that when they put that red rope out the window, they were thinking of Passover. And God gave her a promise. You're going to be okay. But God also gave her a purpose. Let's jump forward a little bit to the end of the story, because certainly we want to know how it turns out. So we jump to verse 23. Then the two men returned. They came down the hills and passed over and came to Joshua, the son of Nun. They told him all that had happened to them. Verse 24, and they said to Joshua, truly, the Lord has given all the land into our hands, and also all the inhabitants of the land melt away because of us. They knew from their conversation with Rahab that everyone was already afraid of them. They used that information, took back good news to Joshua, and they said, with God's help, we've got this. And then what happened? Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. And what happened? The walls came tumbling down. And it's because Rahab protected the spies, gave them the information they needed. Because of Rahab, God was able to bring His people into the first obstacle that held them back from the promised land. Because of Rahab, God fulfilled His plan and His purpose in a very strategic way. Once they conquered God's enemies and they carried out His judgment, they settled in that land that had been promised to them. They even built a temple there where they could meet with Yahweh. And they longed for the day that their Messiah would arrive. Which brings us to God gave her a future. Not only did God give her courage and faith and a promise and a purpose, but He gave her a future. In Joshua chapter 6, we fast forward through the story. In Joshua 6 at 25, Rahab the prostitute and her father's household and all who belonged to her, Joshua saved alive. And she has lived in Israel to this day because she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. In that verse, I want you to notice one phrase that we might otherwise overlook too quickly. Rahab was the prostitute. Her father's house were saved. But then notice what he says when he writes it. She has lived in Israel to this day. Because God gave her courage and faith and a promise and a purpose. He gave her a future. He led the nation, He led His people to adopt her as their own. And she became a part of the nation of Israel. A pagan, an outsider, a prostitute. Now, a welcomed sister in the family. And not only a sister, but an incredible ancestor to the Messiah Himself. In Matthew chapter 1, there is this incredible genealogy. So-and-so is the father of so-and-so, is the father of so-and-so, is the father of so, and we go from way back yonder all the way to Jesus. And as they tell that story, so y'all King Jamesers, you remember the begats. So-and-so begat, so-and-so begat, so-and-so begat, so-and-so begat, so-and-so. And in chapter 1 at verse 5, Salmon, the father of Boaz, by Rahab, Boaz, the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed, the father of Jesse. Jesse was the father of, do you remember last week? David. David, the great king ancestor of Jesus Christ. Rahab, a hooker, a pagan, an enemy of the people of God. And yet God chooses her, blesses her, prepares her, gives her all she needs, and even uses her to bring about the family that leads to Jesus Christ, our Messiah. I'm just here to tell you, sometimes you feel like an outsider. We all do. There are certain times, certain situations that we just don't fit in. But I'm here to tell you, if God can use an outsider like that in such a huge way, don't ever question the fact that God can use you. Yes, you. I know you're an outsider sometimes, but I know that God is bigger than all of that stuff. God's got a purpose for you. First step is He wants you to be adopted into His family just like she was. And from that moment on, He's going to do amazing things in you and through you. But it's not about you. He works in you and through you for His glory, to help other people know that they too can be included and need never live the rest of their lives as outsiders.